The autumn rain fell steadily across Chicago on the evening of October 23rd, 1988, painting the sidewalks with silver reflections of streetlights and neon signs, while creating a symphony of gentle percussion against the windows of the small apartment buildings that lined Ashland Avenue on the city's south side. Inside one of these modest brick buildings, 22-year-old Sarah Mitchell sat on her narrow bed, holding in her trembling hands what represented the culmination of 18 months of saving every spare dollar from her job at the downtown diner, where she waited tables 6 days a week to pay for community college classes and help support her younger brother, since their parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. The object in her hands was a concert ticket, creased from being carried in her wallet and touched so many times that the print had begun to fade, but still clearly readable. Michael Jackson, Dangerous World Tour, United Center, October 24th, 1988, Section 104, Row 12, Seat 15. This ticket represented more than admission to a concert. It was the physical manifestation of a dream that had sustained Sarah through the darkest periods of her young life. Through double shifts at the diner when her feet ached so badly she could barely stand. Through nights of studying by candlelight when the electricity had been turned off. Through moments of despair when the weight of responsibility for keeping her family together seemed too heavy for her 19-year-old shoulders to bear. Michael Jackson's music had been her constant companion during these struggles, his voice providing comfort during sleepless nights, his lyrics offering hope when hope seemed impossible, his example of rising from humble beginnings in Gary, Indiana, proving that circumstances of birth need not determine the boundaries of possibility. Sarah had purchased the ticket 11 months earlier, immediately after they went on sale, standing in line for 14 hours outside the Ticketmaster office with hundreds of other devoted fans, her feet numb from the October cold but her heart warm with anticipation. The $85 the ticket cost had represented a significant sacrifice, money that could have gone toward textbooks, groceries, or the countless other necessities that competed for space in her impossibly tight budget. But she had convinced herself that this was an investment in her sanity, a reward for the sacrifices she had been making, a single evening of pure joy to balance against the months of struggle that surrounded it. The apartment building where Sarah lived was home to mostly elderly residents, people who had spent their lives working in the steel mills and factories that had once made Chicago one of America's great industrial cities. Men and women who now survived on Social Security checks, and the kindness of neighbors in a neighborhood that had seen better days, but still maintained the strong sense of community that had always characterized working-class Chicago. Sarah had become something of a daughter figure to many of these elderly neighbors, helping them with grocery shopping, reading letters from distant relatives, providing the kind of assistance that their own families might have offered if economic necessity hadn't scattered their children across the country in search of opportunities that no longer existed in their hometown. Among these neighbors was Mrs. Elena Kowalski, an 83-year-old Polish immigrant who lived alone in the apartment directly below Sarah's, a woman whose husband had died 5 years earlier after 42 years of marriage and whose 3 children lived in different states, visiting only occasionally despite her declining health and increasing isolation. Mrs. Kowalski had developed a particular fondness for Sarah, recognizing in the young woman's determination and resilience something that reminded her of her own younger self when she had arrived in America with nothing but hope and a willingness to work harder than anyone thought possible. The two had developed a routine of sharing coffee together every Sunday morning, during which Mrs. Kowalski would tell stories about old Poland and young America, while Sarah would share her dreams of finishing college and perhaps someday traveling to see the places she had only read about in books. On this particular rainy October evening, as Sarah sat contemplating the concert ticket that represented her escape from reality scheduled for the following night, she heard an unusual sound from the apartment below, a persistent coughing that seemed to grow more violent with each passing minute, followed by what sounded like something heavy falling to the floor. Sarah's nursing instincts, developed through caring for her sick mother during her final illness, immediately recognized these sounds as signs of distress rather than ordinary discomfort. She slipped on her shoes and hurried downstairs, knocking gently on Mrs. Kowalski's door while calling out softly to avoid alarming the elderly woman if she was simply having trouble sleeping. The response came weakly, barely audible through the door. "Sarah? Is that you, dear? I'm sorry. I don't think I can get up to open the door." Sarah used the spare key that Mrs. Kowalski had given her months earlier for emergencies and found the elderly woman sitting on her kitchen floor, her face pale and her breathing labored, clearly struggling with what appeared to be a severe respiratory illness that had worsened dramatically since their coffee together just that morning. Mrs. Kowalski's apartment was cold, the heating having been turned off to save money, and Sarah could see that her neighbor had been trying to make tea when the coughing fit had overcome her, leaving her too weak to stand. "I'm fine, dear," Mrs. Kowalski whispered, though her condition clearly indicated otherwise. "Just a little cold that won't go away. I don't want to be any trouble." But Sarah's experience caring for her mother had taught her to recognize the signs of serious illness disguised as minor discomfort, and she understood immediately that Mrs. Kowalski needed medical attention that her pride and her limited financial resources had prevented her from seeking. Sarah helped the elderly woman to her feet and onto the couch, covering her with blankets while assessing the situation with the practical efficiency she had learned from managing crisis after crisis in her young life. The nearest hospital was 15 minutes away by car, but Sarah didn't own a car, and Mrs. Kowalski had never learned to drive, depending on public transportation and the kindness of neighbors for mobility. An ambulance would cost money that Mrs. Kowalski didn't have and would likely result in a hospital bill that could force her from her apartment, the last piece of independence she had left. Sarah realized that she could call a taxi, but even that expense would be significant for someone living on a fixed income, and she could see in Mrs. Kowalski's eyes the fear of becoming a burden that elderly people often carry when their bodies begin to betray them. "Mrs. Kowalski," Sarah said gently, sitting beside her neighbor on the worn couch that had been a wedding gift 60 years earlier, "I think you need to see a doctor tonight. This isn't just a cold, and waiting until morning could make it worse." The elderly woman's response was predictable. She couldn't afford a hospital visit. She didn't want to impose on anyone. She was sure she would feel better in the morning if she just got some rest. But Sarah had heard these same arguments from her own mother, had seen how pride and financial fear could prevent people from seeking the medical care they desperately needed, had learned that sometimes love requires overruling the preferences of those we care about in service of their deeper needs. Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. She reached into her wallet and withdrew the concert ticket, looking at it one final time as she calculated the choice before her. The taxi ride to and from the hospital would cost approximately $40. The emergency room visit, even with Mrs. Kowalski's Medicare coverage, would likely require a co-payment of at least $50. Sarah had exactly $37 in cash, money she had been saving for food during the week of the concert when she had planned to eat nothing but celebration meals in honor of finally seeing her idol perform live. But she also had the concert ticket, worth $85 if sold to one of the many fans who would pay premium prices for last-minute access to the sold-out show. Sarah had seen advertisements in the newspaper from desperate fans offering to pay double or triple face value for tickets, and she knew that she could easily find a buyer willing to pay enough to cover Mrs. Kowalski's immediate medical expenses with money left over to ensure that her elderly neighbor would be able to afford groceries for the rest of the month. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitability, the natural consequence of values that had been instilled in her by parents who had taught her that taking care of others was not just morally right, but practically necessary in a world where everyone faced challenges too large to handle alone. Sarah tucked the concert ticket back in her wallet and helped Mrs. Kowalski prepare for the trip to the hospital, gathering medications, insurance cards, and identification while calling a taxi and arranging for a neighbor to check on Mrs. Kowalski's apartment while they were gone. The taxi ride to Northwestern Memorial Hospital took them through downtown Chicago, past the United Center where crews were setting up for the following night's concert, past billboards advertising Michael Jackson's Dangerous World Tour, past street vendors selling unofficial merchandise to early arriving fans who had traveled from across the Midwest to attend the show. Sarah watched these preparations with a mixture of longing and peace, understanding that she was witnessing the culmination of months of anticipation from a different perspective than she had expected, but feeling surprisingly content with the choice she had made. At the hospital, Mrs. Kowalski was diagnosed with pneumonia that had progressed to the point where it could have become life-threatening without prompt treatment. The attending physician, Dr. Maria Santos, explained that the elderly woman would need to stay overnight for observation and intravenous antibiotics, a treatment that would almost certainly save her life, but would require immediate payment of co-payments and deductibles that totaled exactly $83. Sarah excused herself to make a phone call, stepping outside the hospital to dial the number from a newspaper advertisement placed by a Michael Jackson fan who was desperate to pay any price for a good ticket to tomorrow night's show. The transaction took place in the hospital parking lot 20 minutes later, when a middle-aged man named Robert Chun arrived with cash in hand to purchase what he believed was simply a concert ticket, but what actually represented Sarah's transformation from concert-goer to caregiver, from fan to family member, from someone who consumed kindness to someone who created it. Sarah handed over the ticket that had sustained her through months of difficult work and study, accepting in return the money that would ensure Mrs. Kowalski received the medical care she needed and had a comfortable recovery in her own apartment, surrounded by familiar belongings and the dignity of independence. As Sarah returned to the hospital to pay Mrs. Kowalski's bills and arrange for her discharge the following morning, she felt a complex mixture of emotions that she couldn't fully identify. There was sadness at missing the concert she had anticipated for so long, disappointment at losing the escape from reality that the music would have provided, and a touch of resentment at the circumstances that had forced her to choose between her dreams and her responsibilities. But there was also something else, something that felt like relief or satisfaction, or perhaps the simple pleasure that comes from knowing that you have acted in accordance with your deepest values, even when doing so required significant personal sacrifice. Mrs. Kowalski recovered quickly under medical supervision, and by the morning of October 24th, she was back in her apartment with a supply of antibiotics and strict instructions for rest and recuperation. Sarah had spent the night in the hospital's family waiting area, partly to ensure that her neighbor was comfortable, but mostly because she couldn't bear the thought of being alone in her apartment while the concert she had sacrificed was taking place just a few miles away. She had managed to avoid thinking too much about what she was missing until the morning, when she woke to the sound of early arriving fans walking past the hospital on their way to the venue, their excited conversations about the evening ahead serving as a painful reminder of the choice she had made. Sarah returned to her apartment that morning planning to spend the day studying for midterm exams and try not to think about the concert that would begin in 12 hours. The concert where her seat would be occupied by someone else while she sat in her kitchen trying to focus on textbooks, instead of imagining the music she would be missing. She had told no one about her sacrifice, not wanting Mrs. Kowalski to feel guilty about accepting help or her college friends to know about the ticket she had given up, preferring to process her disappointment privately rather than seeking sympathy or praise for her decision. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about the moments when ordinary people make extraordinary choices and discover that kindness creates its own rewards. It was at precisely 9:30 in the morning, as Sarah sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an economics textbook, that she heard an unusual commotion in the hallway outside her apartment. The building was typically quiet at this hour, with most residents either still asleep or going about their morning routines with the considerate silence that comes from living in close proximity to neighbors whose walls are thin and whose privacy is precious. But this morning, Sarah could hear voices, multiple voices, speaking in urgent whispers punctuated by what sounded like the movement of many feet on the creaky wooden floors of the old building. The knock on her door, when it came, was gentle but unmistakably intentional, the kind of knock that suggests the person on the other side knows exactly who they're looking for and has important business to conduct. Sarah assumed it was Mrs. Kowalski, perhaps needing help with her morning medications or wanting to express gratitude for the previous evening's assistance. So she opened the door without looking through the peephole, expecting to see her elderly neighbor's familiar face framed by the hallway's dim lighting. Instead, she found herself looking at Michael Jackson himself, wearing simple black pants and a white button-down shirt, his famous fedora absent, his expression gentle and serious as he stood in the narrow hallway of her modest apartment building surrounded by what appeared to be a small entourage of people who were trying their best to remain invisible despite the impossibility of hiding their presence in such a confined space. For several seconds, Sarah's brain refused to process what her eyes were showing her, convinced that exhaustion and disappointment had combined to create a hallucination so vivid that she could almost believe it was real. "Sarah," Michael said softly, his voice carrying that distinctive whisper that had provided comfort during her most difficult nights, though now it seemed to come from an impossible source standing directly in front of her rather than from a radio or cassette player. "Sarah Mitchell, I'm Michael Jackson, and I was hoping I could talk with you for a few minutes about what you did last night." The hallway seemed to spin around Sarah as the reality of the situation settled into her consciousness. The understanding that the person whose music had sustained her through months of struggle was actually standing in front of her door, in her building, on her floor, speaking her name and asking for her time, as if such a thing could possibly make sense in the ordinary world where she lived and worked and went to school. She managed to nod and step aside, allowing Michael and his small group of companions to enter her tiny apartment, where they seemed to fill the space not with their physical presence, but with the surreal quality of their unexpected arrival. Michael's team included his security coordinator, a representative from his record label, and Dr. Maria Santos, the physician who had treated Mrs. Kowalski the previous evening and who had apparently played a crucial role in bringing this impossible meeting about. Dr. Santos explained that she had been working her shift at Northwestern Memorial when she overheard Sarah's conversation with the ticket buyer in the parking lot, understanding immediately that she was witnessing an extraordinary act of sacrifice that deserved recognition beyond the simple gratitude of an elderly patient. "I have a policy," Dr. Santos explained, her voice filled with the kind of professional warmth that made her an excellent physician, "of paying attention when I see young people making the kind of choices that restore my faith in human nature. When I realized what you had given up to help Mrs. Kowalski, I felt compelled to share your story with someone who might understand its significance." Dr. Santos had spent the remainder of her shift trying to determine how to ensure that Sarah's sacrifice didn't go unrecognized, ultimately deciding to contact Michael Jackson's tour management through the hospital's celebrity relations department, which occasionally handled medical needs for visiting performers and their entourages. She had explained Sarah's situation to a representative who had been so moved by the story that he had immediately shared it with Michael himself, leading to a series of phone calls and arrangements that had culminated in this impossible morning visit. Michael sat down on Sarah's secondhand couch, his presence somehow making the modest apartment feel not smaller, but more significant, as if his genuine interest in being there had transformed the space from a place where someone lived into a place where something important was happening. He listened carefully as Dr. Santos provided additional details about Mrs. Kowalski's condition and Sarah's response, his expression growing more amazed and more moved as he understood the full scope of what Sarah had sacrificed and why she had chosen to make that sacrifice. "Sarah," Michael said, turning to face her directly while his eyes reflected the kind of earnest sincerity that had made him beloved by millions of people around the world. "I've been performing for audiences for most of my life, and I've met thousands of fans in meet-and-greet situations and backstage visits. But I've never met anyone who embodied the spirit of the music I try to create better than you embodied it last night, when you chose to help Mrs. Kowalski instead of attending my concert." Michael explained that his music had always been intended to inspire people to treat each other with kindness, to break down barriers between strangers, to create connections based on shared humanity rather than artificial divisions. "When I heard about what you did," he continued, "I realized that you understood the message of my music better than I've sometimes understood it myself. You didn't just listen to songs about healing the world. You actually healed a small part of it when you chose Mrs. Kowalski's well-being over your own entertainment." What happened next would become one of the most treasured memories of Sarah's life, a moment that transformed her understanding of celebrity, kindness, and the unexpected ways that good actions can create consequences that ripple far beyond their immediate impact. Michael asked if Mrs. Kowalski was well enough to receive visitors, explaining that he wanted to meet the woman whose need had inspired such extraordinary generosity and to thank her personally for giving Sarah the opportunity to demonstrate such beautiful character. Mrs. Kowalski's apartment became the setting for a scene that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew the elderly woman's modest circumstances and private nature. Michael Jackson, one of the most famous people in the world, sat in her kitchen drinking tea from mismatched cups while she showed him photographs from her wedding 60 years earlier and told him stories about immigrating to America with nothing but hope and determination. The conversation lasted for over an hour, during which Michael demonstrated the same genuine interest in Mrs. Kowalski's life story that he had shown in Sarah's sacrifice, asking thoughtful questions about her experiences and sharing his own stories about the importance of family and community in his life. But Michael had not come simply to visit. He had come with gifts that reflected both his gratitude for Sarah's kindness and his understanding of the practical needs that had created the circumstances requiring her sacrifice. For Mrs. Kowalski, he arranged for a private medical insurance supplement that would ensure she never again had to choose between her health and her financial security, along with a monthly grocery delivery service that would guarantee her nutritional needs were met regardless of her limited mobility or fixed income. For Sarah, Michael's gifts were both practical and symbolic, beginning with a full scholarship to complete her education at any college or university in the country, funded through his charitable foundation and designed to eliminate the financial pressures that had forced her to work multiple jobs while trying to study. But beyond the scholarship, Michael offered something even more valuable, a position with his organization that would allow her to identify and assist other young people who were making extraordinary sacrifices to help their communities, essentially professionalizing the kind of caring behavior that had brought them together. I need people working with me who understand that real success isn't measured by album sales or concert attendance, Michael explained as he prepared to leave Sarah's apartment building, but by the positive impact we have on other people's lives. You've already proven that you have that understanding, and I'd be honored to have you help me find ways to support other people who are making the kinds of choices you made last night. The immediate impact of Michael's visit was transformative for both Sarah and Mrs. Kowalski, but the longer-term consequences would prove to be even more significant. Sarah accepted the scholarship and the position with Michael's foundation, eventually earning degrees in social work and nonprofit management, before establishing her own organization dedicated to supporting caregivers who were making personal sacrifices to help elderly or disabled community members. Mrs. Kowalski became one of the first beneficiaries of this organization, which would grow to serve thousands of people across the country who found themselves in similar situations. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Michael's response to Sarah's sacrifice was his decision to share her story publicly, not as a publicity stunt, but as an example of the kind of behavior he hoped his music would inspire in others. During that evening's concert at the United Center, Michael told the audience about Sarah's choice and about his morning visit to her apartment building, explaining that he had learned more about the true meaning of his music from her actions than from years of performing and recording. Tonight, Michael said to the 90,000 people who filled the arena, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system to every corner of the venue, I want to dedicate this show to Sarah Mitchell, who couldn't be here because she chose to help a neighbor in need instead of attending a concert. Her empty seat reminds all of us that the most important performances happen not on stages, but in the quiet moments when we choose kindness over convenience, when we choose to help others, even when it requires personal sacrifice. The concert that followed was widely regarded as one of the most emotionally powerful performances of Michael's career, infused with an energy that seemed to come from his genuine gratitude for Sarah's example and his renewed understanding of the purpose behind his artistic work. Many audience members later reported that the show felt different from other concerts they had attended, more connected to real human experience and less focused on spectacle for its own sake. Years later, when Sarah had become a respected leader in the field of community care and Mrs. Kowalski had celebrated her 90th birthday, surrounded by the extended family of neighbors and supporters that had grown around her, both women would often reflect on the morning when Michael Jackson knocked on their door and transformed their understanding of how individual acts of kindness can create ripple effects that extend far beyond their original scope. The concert ticket that Sarah had sacrificed was eventually returned to her, framed and autographed, along with a personal note from Michael thanking her for teaching him that the most meaningful music happens not when performers entertain audiences, but when people choose to care for each other with the same passion and dedication that artists bring to their craft. The ticket hangs in Sarah's office today, a reminder that some sacrifices create rewards that are more valuable than anything we give up to make them, and that the most beautiful performances often happen not on stages, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over self-interest and discover that kindness has its own music, its own rhythm, its own power to transform ordinary moments into something approaching magic. The morning of October 24th, 1988, had begun with Sarah missing a concert and ended with her discovering a new purpose for her life, proving that sometimes the things we think we want most are actually distraction from the things we need most, and that the most extraordinary meetings often happen not in the places we expect them, but in the humble settings where we live our real lives, where our true character reveals itself, and where strangers become family through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing to care for each other across the artificial boundaries that too often keep us apart in a world that needs more bridges and fewer walls.